in the heart of Kruger National Park, where golden grass stretched endlessly beneath the blazing African sun, there lived a lion whose name would echo through generations, Musafa. He was more than just a lion, he was a legend. A shadow that loomed over the savannah, a ruler whose reign was carved into the land itself. Those who had seen him never forgot. Those who had crossed him never lived to tell the tale. Musafa's presence was overwhelming. His mane, thick and dark, framed his massive head like the crown of a king. It flowed down his muscled shoulders, marking him as a warrior, a conqueror, a lion who had seen more battles than most could survive. His body was a masterpiece of strength, rippling with raw power, every muscle refined by the unforgiving laws of the wild. But it was his eyes, piercing, golden, unyielding, that defined him. They held the weight of a ruler, the cold calculation of a hunter, and the quiet menace of a predator who knew he had no equal. The animals of Kruger feared Musafa, and for good reason. He did not hunt for sport, nor did he waste his strength on meaningless battles. Every step he took had purpose. Every movement was precise. When he stalked his prey, the outcome was inevitable. Impalas, zebras, and wildebeests learned to recognize the scent of death in the air when Musafa was near. His hunts were swift, efficient, ruthless, a single charge, a leap with the power of a thunderbolt, and his prey would be silenced forever beneath his crushing jaws. But Musafa was not merely a predator of herbivores, he was the nightmare of all who dared challenge him. Hyenas, notorious for their boldness and their strength in numbers, knew better than to test his patience. They had learned their lesson in blood. A pack had once dared to steal his kill, thinking their numbers would overwhelm him. Musafa did not hesitate. He did not roar. He did not warn them. He moved like a storm, his massive paws striking with the force of a hammer. In minutes, the ground was littered with the broken bodies of those foolish enough to test the uncrowned king. Other lions, too, feared him. In the brutal hierarchy of the wild, strength was the only law, and Musafa was the enforcer. He had fought and defeated the strongest males, sent them limping into exile, or left him to die beneath the unrelenting African sun. He did not need a coalition to rule, his power was enough. Even those who had never faced him in battle knew his name. They smelled his scent in the wind and turned away. They heard his roar in the distance and knew it was not a challenge, but a declaration: this land belongs to me. Yet, despite the fear he commanded, Musafa was not reckless. He was not a brute, nor was he a tyrant. He ruled with the wisdom of a lion who understood that true power was not just about winning fights but knowing when to walk away from them. He did not waste his strength chasing every challenger. He did not fight for the sake of fighting. He fought when he had to. And when he did, there was no mercy. To the humans who tracked the lives of Kruger's lions, Musafa was a wonder. Rangers followed his movements, speaking of him in hushed tones, marveling at his longevity, his endurance, his ability to survive in a world where even kings could fall in an instant. Tourists who were lucky enough to see him returned home with stories that bordered on myth. "I saw him," they would say. "I saw Musafa, the king." There was no doubt about it, he was a ruler. But one without a throne, a lion without a crown. And yet, his rule was absolute. He was the uncrowned king of Kruger, and as long as he walked the earth, no creature, man or beast, would ever forget his name. The golden days of Musafa were fading. The lion who once ruled the vast grasslands of Kruger with unquestionable might now walked alone. His once magnificent mane beginning to thin. His powerful frame no longer as formidable as it had been. Time, the one enemy no creature could escape, had begun to take its toll. Musafa felt the change long before the world noticed it. His muscles, once taut and unyielding, ached after long chases. His hunts, once executed with ruthless precision, began to falter. The spring in his stride was no longer effortless. The energy in his body slower to return after each hunt. A kill that would have once taken him moments now required patience he had never needed before. And sometimes, patience was not enough. The antelope was still as fast, their instincts just as sharp. But Musafa was no longer the relentless force he had once been. He missed his targets more often, his once flawless ambushes undone by hesitation, by exhaustion. More and more, he found himself walking away from failed hunts with an empty stomach. His ribs beginning to press against his golden coat. The power he had wielded so effortlessly now slipped through his grasp like sand in the wind. And then came the betrayals. For years, Musafa had ruled without question, his presence alone enough to command loyalty. But the lions of the savannah followed only one law, the law of strength. As his body weakened, so did their faith in him. The lionesses that had once relied on him for protection began to stray, their instincts pushing them toward younger, stronger males. They did not hate him, but they could not afford to stay with a king who could no longer fight for them. The coalition he had once formed, if it could even be called that, had long since drifted apart. He had ruled mostly alone. And now, that solitude became his reality. The days of walking confidently through the plains, knowing his presence alone could send rivals retreating, were gone. Now, he moved carefully, not because he feared, but because he knew that one wrong step, one miscalculation, could mean death. But it was not the lions that were his greatest threat. It was the scavengers. The hyenas had always feared Musafa, their kind knowing better than to test his patience. He had sent many of them to their graves, their broken bodies left in his wake. But now, they began to watch him differently. They followed at a distance, not in fear, but in anticipation. They saw the hesitation in his steps, the exhaustion in his eyes. They listened to his roars, once deep and powerful, now lacking their former force. At first, they were cautious. They remembered what he was, even if he was not quite the same anymore. But hunger drives all creatures, and the scent of weakness is intoxicating. The first time they challenged him, Musafa was still strong enough to remind him of their place. A younger hyena had made the mistake of drawing too close while he fed on a stolen carcass. Musafa struck with the rage of the king he had once been, his powerful jaws snapping the intruder's spine before flinging its lifeless body to the ground. The others scattered, their instincts screaming that the old lion was still dangerous. But even as he stood over the broken body, victorious, Musafa felt it, the cost of the battle. His breathing was heavier than it should have been. His muscles burned in a way that was unfamiliar. The wounds he had suffered in the scuffle did not heal as quickly as they once had. The hyenas did not forget. They had lost one of their own. But they had gained something more valuable, confirmation. Musafa was still dangerous, but he was no longer invincible. And so, they watched. They waited. Days turned to weeks, and Musafa's struggles grew worse. His hunts failed more often than they succeeded. His strength, once legendary, was now barely enough to defend what little he had left. Hunger gnawed at him, making every movement slower, every fight more costly. The land he had once ruled so effortlessly now seemed vast and merciless. And the hyenas grew bolder. They began trailing him openly, their laughter ringing through the night like the sound of death itself. They tested him, inching closer when he was weak, scattering only when he forced himself to rise, to snarl, to remind him that he was still a lion. But each time, it took him longer to stand. Each time, his roars carried less certainty. Then came the night that changed everything. Musafa had found a meal, a dying wildebeest too weak to flee. It was not a kill he would have taken in his prime. But pride had long since been stripped from him. He needed to eat, and in the wild, survival always came first. He tore into the flesh, his hunger overpowering his exhaustion. He did not hear them at first. The wind carried their scent, but he was too focused, too desperate to notice. When he finally lifted his head, they were already there, not a few this time, but a pack, 15, maybe more. Their leader, a massive female with battle scars of her own, stood at the front, eyes locked onto his. There was no fear in them, only hunger. The others fanned out, surrounding him, cutting off his escape. Musafa rose to his full height, muscles screaming in protest, but he forced himself to stand tall. He would not show weakness. Not now. The first attack came from his left, a feint, meant to test his reaction. He snarled, snapping his jaws, and the hyena darted back. The others did not move. They were patient. They had waited for this moment for too long. Then, the leader lunged. Musafa struck first, his claws raking across her muzzle. Drawing blood, she yelped, stumbling back, but the others were already in motion. They swarmed him, their sharp teeth finding his legs, his flanks, his already weakened body. He roared, the sound shaking the earth. But it no longer had the power to drive him away. He fought as he always had. With all the strength left in his body, he sent one hyena crashing into the dust with a powerful swipe. Another he caught in his jaws, shaking it until it went limp. But there were too many, and he was no longer the king he once was. Their teeth found his throat. His vision blurred. The world, once so full of life, now seemed distant. The sounds of the hyena's laughter faded into nothing. As the night swallowed him, Musafa did not feel fear. He had ruled the land longer than most ever could. He had been a king without a crown, a lion who had defied everything. And now, as the stars shone overhead, his reign had finally come to an end. But legends never truly die. And in the whispers of the wind, in the stories told beneath the moon, the uncrowned king would live forever. The sun had barely begun to rise over the golden plains of Kruger when the scent of blood filled the air. The grass, once a sea of amber swaying gently in the morning breeze, was now trampled, darkened with crimson. At the center of it all lay Musafa. He was barely breathing. The great lion, once a ruler of the savannah, was surrounded. The hyenas had finally won. Their laughter echoed through the open land, shrill and victorious. Their eyes glowed with hunger, their bodies tense with anticipation. Musafa no longer had the strength to stand, his legs trembling beneath him. His once magnificent mane was matted with dirt and blood, his golden coat marred by deep, oozing wounds. The old king was finished. A particularly bold hyena crept forward, baring its teeth, preparing for the final strike. Mustafa tried to lift his head, tried to summon one last growl, one final act of defiance. But his body betrayed him. His vision swam, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Then, a sound cut through the morning silence, sharp, commanding, human. A gunshot. The hyenas froze. Their ears twitched, their eyes flickering toward the source of the sound. Another shot rang out, this time closer. A warning. The pack hesitated. They had won this battle. But they knew better than to challenge a man with firepower. With irritated snarls, they backed away, slinking into the shadows of the tall grass, disappearing as swiftly as they had appeared. And then, stepping cautiously into the clearing, came Sifo Imbele. Sifo had been a ranger in Kruger for more years than he cared to count. He had seen many lions rise and fall, watched them rule with power and fade into obscurity. But Mustafa was different. He was more than just another lion. He was a symbol, a force of nature, a legend that had commanded both respect and fear. For years, Sifo had tracked him, watched him hunt, witnessed his battles. He had seen the lion in his prime, ruling the plains with an authority that no other could challenge. And he had seen him weaken. Now, as he stood over the fallen king, Sifo's heart clenched. Mustafa was barely clinging to life. His breathing was shallow, his body motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his ribs. His wounds were severe, deep gashes torn into his flesh. His flanks shredded by the relentless bites of the hyenas. Blood seeped into the dry earth beneath him. Sifo knew that in the wild, nature had its own rules. The weak did not survive. But looking down at Mustafa, he made a decision. He would not let this lion die here. Moving quickly, Sifo pulled the radio from his belt and called for backup. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he pressed the device to his lips. "This is Sifo. I found Mustafa. He's down. He's hurt, badly. I need a rescue team. Now." The response was immediate. The team would be on their way. Sifo turned back to Mustafa. The lion's eyes fluttered open for a moment, dull and unfocused. For the first time in his life, Mustafa did not seem like a king. He seemed tired, defeated, but he was still breathing. That was enough. As gently as he could, Sifo knelt beside the massive lion. His rifle remained slung across his back, but his hands were empty. He wasn't here to fight, he was here to help. "You're not dying today, old man," Sifo murmured. "Not like this." Minutes passed like hours. The morning sun climbed higher, and the heat intensified. Flies swarmed around Mustafa's open wounds. Sifo swatted him away, feeling the seconds stretch endlessly as he waited. Then, at last, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. The rescue team worked quickly. They moved with the efficiency of men who had done this before. But even they hesitated when they saw Mustafa. "He's in bad shape," one of them muttered, shaking his head. "We might be too late." "We're not," Sifo said firmly. "Get the stretcher." Lifting Mustafa onto the transport was no easy feat. He was a massive lion, even in his weakened state. It took 4 men to roll him carefully onto the canvas stretcher, their hands careful not to press too hard on his wounds. Even unconscious, he was dangerous. But Mustafa did not fight. His body sagged under its own weight. And when they secured him onto the truck, He did not stir. As the vehicle roared to life, Sifo climbed into the back, sitting beside the wounded king. His gaze never left the lion. "Hold on," he whispered. "You've survived worse." The journey to the rescue center was long and bumpy. Every turn jostled Musafa's body. And each time, Sifo held his breath, waiting for a sign that the lion was still alive. He pressed his fingers lightly against the lion's massive chest, feeling the slow, labored thump of his heart. Still breathing, still fighting. When they arrived, the team wasted no time. The vets swarmed around Musafa, their voices overlapping as they assessed his injuries. Sifo watched as they worked, his fists clenched at his sides. The prognosis was grim. "He's lost too much blood. These wounds are deep, infected. He might not make it through the night." Sifo exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. He had known it would be bad, but hearing it aloud made the weight settle in his chest. He stepped forward. "Do whatever you can," he said simply. "He's not just any lion." The team nodded. They understood. Hours passed. The world outside continued as it always did. But inside the rescue center, time moved differently. The sound of machines monitoring Musafa's heart filled the room. The scent of antiseptic masked the smell of blood. And Sifo waited. Night fell. And then, sometime before dawn, the vet emerged. "He's stable, for now." Sifo let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Musafa had survived battles. He had defeated rivals, faced starvation, and outlasted every challenge nature had thrown at him. But this fight against time, against death itself, was his greatest battle yet. And he had won. For now, Sifo sat beside the recovering lion, watching as his chest rose and fell. Slow but steady. He was not the king he once was. He would never rule the savannah again. But he was alive. And as long as he lived, his story was not over. The uncrowned king had one more chapter to write. The days stretched into weeks. Musafa lay motionless at first, his massive body weak from the battle he had barely survived. The deep wounds from the hyenas had been cleaned and stitched, the infections treated, and his body nourished with food and water. Yet, for a long time, he remained silent, watching, waiting, as if unsure whether to trust this new world he had been pulled into. The rescue center was a strange place for a lion who had once ruled the wild. The sounds of the savannah had been replaced by the quiet murmurs of veterinarians, the hum of medical equipment, and the distant voices of other recovering animals. Here, there were no battles to fight, no rival males to chase away, no prey to stalk. For the first time in his life, Musafa had nothing to conquer. At first, he resisted. When the caretakers approached, he growled weakly, his instinct urging him to fight, to defend himself. His golden eyes, though dulled by exhaustion, still burned with the spirit of a warrior. But he was too weak to rise, too tired to strike. Instead, he watched them warily, his body tense, waiting for the threat that never came. Days passed, and the hands that once seemed foreign became familiar. The pain in his body lessened. The food they brought was not something he had hunted, but it filled his stomach nonetheless. The water was cool, soothing his parched throat. The humans did not hurt him. They did not challenge him. Slowly, Musafa realized something he had never known before. These creatures were not his enemies. And then there was Sifo. The ranger visited often, more than anyone else. He never brought weapons, never forced Musafa to move. He simply sat, watching over the old lion, speaking to him in a voice that carried something different from the others. Respect, understanding, memory. You were something else out there, old man, Sifo would say, leaning against the fence of Musafa's enclosure. His gaze thoughtful. I've watched you chase down buffalo twice your size. I've seen you send younger lions running with just a look. You ruled it all once. Musafa would meet his gaze. And though he could not understand the words, there was something in Sifo's tone that resonated. A shared past, a history written in the dust of the savannah. Sometimes, when the sun hung low in the sky, Sifo would sit in silence, as if remembering those days himself. The days when Musafa's roar had shaken the earth, when he had prowled the grasslands as an unstoppable force. The days when the savannah had belonged to him. But time does not slow for kings, even those without a crown. As the weeks turned to months, Musafa recovered, but he was never the same. His wounds healed, but his strength did not fully return. The great lion who had once ruled with unmatched power could now barely manage a slow, measured walk. His steps were careful, his movements deliberate, as if each one was a reminder of what he had lost. His mane, once thick and dark, had grown thin, patches of gray creeping in like whispers of time. His muscles, once powerful and commanding, had softened. The lion who had once faced down entire prides now walked with the weight of age pressing upon him. But through it all, his eyes never changed. They still held fire, a dimmed flame, perhaps, but a fire nonetheless. Sifo saw it every time he visited. He saw it when Musafa sat in the late afternoon sun, his head still high, his gaze still sharp, as if surveying an invisible kingdom. He saw it when Musafa growled low and deep at the distant sounds of hyenas. A warning that even in old age, even in this caged world, he was still a lion. He still got it in him. One of the veterinarians said one day, watching as Musafa struggled to his feet, shaking off the stiffness in his joints. Not enough to go back out there. But, enough. Enough. It was a word that lingered in Sifo's mind long after the conversation had ended. Musafa would never return to the wild. That much was certain. His body, though healed, could no longer handle the demands of the savannah. Out there, the young lions had taken over. The hyenas had grown bolder. The world he had once ruled had moved on without him. And yet, in his own way, Musafa had accepted this. He did not pace restlessly. He did not challenge the fences. He spent his days basking in the sunlight, watching the world through tired but still proud eyes. He did not need a kingdom to remember he had been a king. The end, Sifo knew, was drawing closer. There was no stopping time. No force could reclaim the strength that had once been. But there was peace in these final days. In the quiet understanding that Musafa had lived a life few ever could. And so, Sifo continued to visit. He sat with the old lion as the days passed. As the sun rose and fell. As the winds carried whispers of a life that had once been. And Musafa, though weaker with each passing day, continued to lift his head high, his spirit unbroken. The uncrowned king of Kruger had fought his last battle. But in the eyes of those who had seen him, in the stories that would be told for years to come, he would never truly fade. Legends never do. The story of Musafa did not end with his battles, nor with his fall from the throne of the savannah. even as his body weakened and time drained the strength from his limbs. His presence endured, and as the final chapter of his life unfolded, Musafa did not fade into obscurity. Instead, he became something greater, a symbol. At the conservation center, Musafa was no longer just an old lion recuperating from the brutalities of nature. He was a living testament to survival, to resilience, to the untamed spirit of the wild. His story became more than whispers carried by the wind. It became a lesson, a warning, and an inspiration. Word spread. The lion that had once ruled the plains was now within reach. And people came from everywhere to see him. Tourists who had once roamed Kruger in search of the great predators now arrived with a different purpose. They gathered around his enclosure, some expecting to see a beast still filled with the fury of his past. Others simply wanting to witness the legend before it was too late. But what they found was something else entirely. Musafa no longer moved with the silent menace of a hunter. His steps were slow, his muscles stiff with age. But his posture remained regal. His mane, though thinned and streaked with gray, still framed his massive head like a faded crown. His golden eyes, though dulled by time, still held the weight of 1,000 battles. And then, there was his roar. It was not the earth-shaking sound it had once been. It did not carry across the plains, warning challenges to stay away. It was softer now, raspier, as though each breath required more effort than the last. But it was still Musafa's roar. And when he lifted his head and let out that final sound of defiance, of pride, of remembrance, it silenced those who heard it. It was a voice that carried stories. A voice that spoke of a lion who had once ruled the wild with unmatched strength. A voice that whispered of victories and defeats, of loneliness and survival, of a life that had been lived to its fullest. For the conservationists, Musafa was more than just a legend. He was proof of the raw brutality of the wild, of the inevitability of change, and of the responsibility humans had toward the creatures they shared the world with. His life had been defined by power, but his legacy would be one of awareness. His presence inspired campaigns for the protection of lions across Africa. His story was told to children learning about the fragile balance of nature, about the way even the mightiest could fall if they were not protected. Schools brought students to see him, to understand that behind every lion's roar was a fight for survival. That for every Musafa who had ruled, there were many who never had the chance. And yet, for all the admiration he received, Musafa remained as he always had been, solitary. He did not seek attention. He did not acknowledge the crowds that came to see him. He spent his days resting beneath the shade, his body weary, his mind lost in memories of the land he had once ruled. But when the sun began to dip below the horizon, when the wind carried the scents of the savanna he had once walked, Musafa would rise, and he would roar. It was weaker now, a whisper of what it had been. But in that sound was something greater than power. It was the voice of a lion who had lived through everything, glory and loss, triumph and struggle. It was the sound of a king who had ruled and fallen, but never broken. Sifo was always there to listen. The ranger never stopped visiting, never stopped watching over the lion he had once feared, then respected, and finally, cared for. He spoke to Musafa as he always had, even when he knew the old lion did not understand. "You did well," Sifo would say, watching as the lion lay beneath the darkening sky. "You did more than most." There was no response. But Sifo didn't need one. He had learned that words were not always necessary. Sometimes, presence alone was enough. And then, one evening, as the sun cast its last golden light over Kruger, Musafa did not rise. Sifo knew before he even stepped closer. The great lion lay motionless beneath his favorite tree. His body still, his breath finally quiet. Musafa had gone where all kings eventually go. But his story did not end. They buried him not far from where he had once ruled. In the land that had shaped him. In the soil that had carried his paw prints for so many years. And above his resting place, a simple plaque was placed. Musafa, the uncrowned king of Kruger. A legend never forgotten. His name would live on, spoken in stories told beneath the stars. His image, now etched into history, would remind all who came after him that even the mightiest must bow to time. But strength was not only in power, it was in endurance. In resilience. In the ability to fight until the very end. Musafa had been a king without a crown. And yet, he had become something far greater. A symbol, a legend, a force that would never fade.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.